Not just because these are the most popular fruits and vegetables consumed by Americans, and not just because they're fairly easy to grow for most home gardeners. I want you to grow more of these 4 in 2025 because if Trump is successful with his mass deportation plans, our already broken food system could be shattered. Hey, this is Casey and I'm One Mellow Marigold, and in this video we're going to talk about expanding your growing yield of tomatoes, strawberries, potatoes, and avocados because the next 4 years could get a little crazy. Ever since colonizers first landed on Turtle Island, we have been looking for others to grow our nutrition needed for our very existence. While subsistence farming has been popular from the very beginning, many farmers really struggled to grow enough food they needed to feed their families for an entire year. And to this day, while subsistence farming seems to be the ideal, at least if you listen to conservative homesteaders, it's largely unattainable for most Americans. Americans first relied on trading with or forcing indigenous communities to produce their food. And then, of course, our country relied heavily on slavery and indentured servitude of immigrants to produce the food that we eat. Today, we rely on immigrants to feed us, primarily coming from Mexico. And it's important to note that while some workers do have an H-2A visa to be here, roughly half of hired farm workers have legal immigration status. Farmers have been struggling to find laborers for years, and the problem is only going to get worse. Most Americans are unwilling or unable to physically work on the farm fields to harvest the produce that we need. It's hot, physically demanding, grueling work. And we've been all too happy to leave that harvesting to somebody else. I would bet that most Americans have no idea what working conditions are like for farm workers, and I hope we can start changing that. And rather than supporting their needs, paying higher wages, and providing a path to citizenship, our next administration wants to demonize them and kick them all out. The 4 types of produce that we're discussing today rely the most heavily on immigrant labor, and if Trump's cruel plans are successful, they will be the most affected, which means an increase in cost and a decrease in availability. Let's kick it off with tomatoes. There is no surprise that tomatoes are the #1 crop grown by home gardeners. Who has not felt like the rush of joy and a little bit of power when you pick that first juicy, red, ripe tomato of the season? And even if you're somebody like me who doesn't actually like the texture of a whole raw tomato, there is no question that the soups and the stews and the salsas and the spaghetti sauces that come from your own garden taste a million times better than anything you could buy from the store. Tomatoes are the second most consumed vegetable in the US, second only to potatoes. And even though we grow a lot of tomatoes in the US, it doesn't nearly meet our demand. Domestic production of our tomatoes is about 40% US, 60% imported. And they're imported mostly from Mexico. California and Florida are the leading producers of tomatoes, and it's no surprise that they also hire the largest amount of immigrant workers. Tell me where you fall compared to this stat. The average American eats 93.6 pounds of tomatoes each year. Tomatoes themselves are harvested both by hand and machine. Depends on the farm, it depends on the variety, and it depends on the tomato's final destination. Tomatoes don't always ripen at the same time, and so plants and rows need to be constantly revisited by farm laborers. Working conditions are largely unsafe. They are exposed to the sun and high heat, which is only getting worse with climate change. They also have to fear the exposure to fertilizers and pesticides, in addition to bodily injury, in addition to sexual assault, and in addition to insane working hours. Fun fact, did you know that farm workers are often paid piece rate? Yeah. That means by the bucket. That means they take a bucket or a basket out into the field, and when it's full, they dump it into a big bin, and they get credit for that bucket. That's how they get paid. It is egregious that we as a society continue to demonize immigrants while at the same time expecting them to produce the very food we need to live. So if you can grow, I highly recommend that you grow more. This last year, I grew approximately 40 pounds of tomatoes here at the farm, and that supply roughly lasted me halfway through the year. So I guess I'm kind of on track for that 93.6 pound per average per person. My stepdad, David, is way better at growing tomatoes than I am, though. So hopefully one day I'll be up in his category. So to grow more, especially if you have limited space, start thinking vertically. James Prigioni, if you don't already follow him, you probably do. He's super popular. He has a great video on vertical trellising. So if you're somebody who's currently growing and wants to grow more, I've linked his video down in the description. In addition, you may want to think about growing heirloom varieties that are more resistant to pests. You can also maybe consider growing in a greenhouse or a hoop house to sort of help stabilize environmental conditions. And finally, I know that blight can be a damage to any yield for any gardener. So using soaker hoses to water your tomatoes rather than spraying from a hose or just relying on rain can go a long way to keep blight at bay. And of course, if you happen to grow too much, more than you can store, preserve, what have you, make sure you're sharing with a neighbor as well. Let's move right into strawberries. And oh my goodness, are homegrown strawberries not the best? Americans crave strawberries. They are the #1 most popular berry in the US by far. And the US is the second largest grower of strawberries, just behind China, and Mexico is the third. Like tomatoes, strawberries are particularly labor intensive because strawberries don't all ripen at the same time. So again, rows and plants have to be visited multiple times in the harvest season. And even though strawberries tend to be grown slightly off the ground on mounds, it still requires a lot of bending and stooping in a very hot sun, and often running, because again, farm laborers are generally paid piece rates. So they are literally rushing to dump one filled basket and to rush out into the field with the next empty one. The US does meet most of its demand for strawberries. So we grow about 78% here, 22% is imported, and again, mostly from Mexico. California, then Florida, then Washington are our leading producers, and the average American consumes about 8 pounds of strawberries in the year. And honestly, 8 pounds of strawberries is fairly reasonable for a home grower to be able to grow. So when thinking about growing a higher yield of strawberries at home, consider a couple of things. Maybe consider growing multiple varieties that ripen at various times throughout the season. You can also think about growing in containers or tall stacking towers to help with pest management. And of course, bird netting and shade cloth can be used to keep the birds away. Just real quick, before we get to 3 and 4. It's just not possible to feed the entire country out of our backyard gardens. In addition, that thought process leans on us as an individual, and we cannot think of ourselves as individuals within a larger broken system. It just doesn't work. We have got to think about what's best for all of us, for the whole community. We've got to look at farm work as something important and necessary, and we have to pay them more. We have to create safer working conditions. We have to make sure they have appropriate housing and pathways to citizenship. It would be morally reprehensible of us to just try to solve the food crisis on our own by growing at home and then just ignoring the needs of farm workers altogether. Let's think community and not just individuality and self-sufficiency. And our most consumed vegetable in the US is potatoes. Of course it's potatoes. We love us some potatoes. I love me some potatoes. There is no doubt that potatoes are super popular. The average American eats 117 pounds of potatoes every year. That is popular. That's whole potatoes, your mashed potatoes, your French fries, all the different potato dishes you get at all your favorite restaurants, all the potatoes that you cook in your own home. 117 pounds per year per person. Of the 4 foods we're talking about today, potatoes is the one that the U.S. really produces the vast majority of on its own. The U.S., specifically Idaho, produces 90% of our demand. We do import about 10%, mostly from Canada. But of course, like all the other foods we're talking about, we're here because they require a lot of labor. And again, while mechanization is helping to reduce how much human labor we need, potatoes are grown in the ground. And a potato is a heavy vegetable. They need to be dug out of the ground. And so we're right back to the same understanding where farm workers are in the fields. They have to dig up and out the potatoes and haul them in baskets. Can you even think about and imagine how your back would hold up after just one day of digging potatoes out of the ground? What about after a whole harvest season? That's what farm workers do for us. You might think to yourself, well, potatoes are pretty cheap, so I'm not going to bother growing them because I can get them pretty cheap at the store. Are they really going to stay that cheap after mass deportations? We shall find out. The good news is potatoes are amazingly easy to grow. You can grow them in a ton of different ways. You don't need a lot of space. So before I moved to the farm, I was growing them out of a big old stock tank. It was great. And I managed to produce between 15 and 20 pounds a year from that one stock tank. Not enough to meet my overall need, but enough to last me through the winter. And because you're a home grower, you have the opportunity to grow them in a number of different types of containers. You can grow them in laundry baskets. You can grow them in cloth shopping bags. You can grow them in regular planters. You can grow them in the ground. You could use the Ruth Stout method. You can grow them in potato towers. There's a bunch of different ways to grow potatoes that you almost have no excuse not to try it at least once. If you're like me and you're in a climate where you get hard freezes over the winter, you're going to need to come up with a way to keep them cold but not freezing. Perhaps in coolers, using pine shavings, things like that. You can also process and freeze them. You can also dehydrate them. So you're going to want to start thinking about how you're going to use those 100 pounds of potatoes. And of course, as always, share with a neighbor what you can't use yourself. Last but definitely not least, we have to talk about avocados. Now, avocados are the one food of the four we're talking about today that are not quite as easy for home growers, mostly because of climate. Avocados in the US can only be grown in zones 9 through 11. And once you get an avocado tree established, it can take up to 6 years for it to actually produce fruit. Now, once you get it there, I understand that the maintenance of an avocado tree is not all that intensive. So if you can get your tree there and you live in one of those zones, I highly recommend growing avocados. You might even find yourself a little side business here in the future. Americans' thirst for avocados went crazy. I know it's really funny to sort of blame it on the millennials and their avocado toast, but over the course of the last 20 years, the demand in the US for avocados has grown 443%. And we produce almost none of it. 10% of our avocados are grown here in the US, and California is the leading producer. The other 90%, you guessed it, they come from Mexico. And just like strawberries, the average American eats about 8 pounds of avocados per year. Like the 3 other foods we're talking about today, avocados are high maintenance. They all have to be hand-picked, and they don't all ripen at the same time. And a lot of great care has to be taken to make sure that there's no bruising during the harvesting process. There's also a huge dark side to the growing of avocado. Farmers in Mexico took the opportunity of our increased demand and built larger avocado farms. And they were making good money until the cartels moved in. And if you want to learn more about how the cartels and the avocado industry are related, and honestly, you really do, there are 2 pieces of information I think you should review. One is a video called Keeping Americans Fed, The Power and Exploitation of Immigrant and Migrant Communities. The link is in the description below. And the second is a great listen by NPR called The Violent Underbelly of the Avocado Industry. When cartels saw that farmers were making good money growing and exporting avocados, they moved in and they would charge farmers extravagant fees, and it was basically pay up or die. They moved into towns and villages and wreaked havoc. If you're someone that really loves and eats a lot of avocados, I highly recommend you look into this on your own further. Not because I want you to feel guilty for doing so, but I think it's important to really understand the loss and the hardship that go along with producing the food that you eat every day. I certainly love me an avocado, but NPR's The Violent Underbelly really had me rethinking whether or not I would continue eating them in the future. And that is where I'm going to stop for today. Those are 4 foods that I want you to grow more of in 2025. Now listen, this video is not intended to drive your behavior by fear. Doing anything out of fear alone is rarely productive. And of course, we don't know for sure what the future holds. But I do believe in the power of education and community and starting where we are. And maybe where you're at today is thinking a little bit more about the food system that delivers the food that you eat every day. And maybe the next time you eat a strawberry or a really fresh tomato, you're going to think about the person breaking their back in the field to deliver that tomato to you. And just maybe you'll think about growing more on your own, which honestly is awesome, because just growing things is fantastic. It's so good for you in a million different ways. So I'm going to encourage you, like I always do, grow what you can from home. Learn more. But I also want you to put that same amount of effort into learning about the food system that delivers the rest of the food to you. That's all I got for today, friends. As always, I love you so much. I hope you found this video educational and helpful. If you haven't clicked that subscribe button, hit that little logo of mine and you'll be all set. I have provided all of my references and sources in the description if you want to learn more on any of these topics. And feel free to leave comments below. I do largely read all of them and I really do try to reply. And I'm going to talk to you real soon, okay? Good luck with your garden planning. Bye!